Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to the newspaper review. I am Cassie Tony, and I'll be taking you through this segment. First, we'll start with the Vanguard. Boldly written, APC primaries, petition pour in as party clears Uzodimma, Fubara, Alli, and others. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 46, UN seeks independence, probe into Nigeria-Chad air strikes. Still in the same newspaper on page 6 and page 7. Court jails ex-power minister Mamman, 75 years over 33.8 billion naira fraud. Why I visited APC chairman, says Wike. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Then on page 19 of the newspaper as well. Nigeria's oil output rises marginally, short of OPEC quota. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom on page 8, 2027, Kwankwaso tackles Baba Ahmed over alleged demand for PRP presidential ticket. Still in the same newspaper on page 12 as well. Conflicting court rulings threaten banking stability. CJ Soho wants. You get that on page 12 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 9. Nigeria spends 6.54 trillion naira to import auto parts in 2 years, coming from DG NADDC. Moving away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune, boldly written on page 16. 33 billion naira fraud. Court jails ex-power minister for 75 years. At the top of the newspaper, NDLEA intercepts 10.4 billion naira Canadian loud at Lagos port. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 18, NUC VC sign performance contract on $65 million World Bank project. NHRC worries over recurrent civilian casualties from air strikes. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, federal government fixed June 17 for digital switch over. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, I will choose competence over party. Makinde on choice of successor. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of the newspaper on page 3, Ekiti Urban, Fayose Ojudu describe Onyebanji as builder of modern Ekiti. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun, boldly written on page 4, ex-power minister backs jail term, urban admission crashes. Ex-power minister backs jail term, urban ambition crashes. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Then on page 22 and page 23 of the newspaper, my near-death experience. Igwe Achebe Obi of Onitsha. My near-death experience, says Igwe Achebe Obi of Onitsha. Then on page 6 of the newspaper, Nigeria top 77 countries in malnutrition cases, coming from MSF. At the bottom of the newspaper, Otedola tightens grip on first holdco, acquires additional 43.41 billion naira shares. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. NDC gets respite as court dismisses ADA suit against INEC. NDC gets respite as court dismisses ADA suit against INEC. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Insecurity, deploy core members in state of origin. Insecurity, deploy core members in state of origin. Masop advises. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. Alleged embryo sale, trial of Abuja medical doctor Abebe shifts to June 18. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust, boldly written, Amabila project tolls, court jails Mamman 75 years for 33.8 billion naira fraud. You get the full gist on page 3 and page 4 of the newspaper. Then on page 10 of the newspaper at the top. Barau laus Tinubu, says consensus arrangement fostering unity. You get the full story on page 10 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, EFCC arrests Energy Commission DG over alleged 500 billion naira money laundering. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 11. Obi Kwankwaso wanted automatic ticket in PRP. Hazim Baba Ahmed says. He says Obi Kwankwaso wanted automatic ticket in PRP. Then on page 19 of the newspaper, Otedola tightens first hold co control with 43 billion naira shares. Still in the same newspaper, gunmen killed 2 custom officers in Kebbi. You get the full story on page 26 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to The Guardian, boldly written, IMF exposes Nigeria's budgeting gaps as execution crisis deepen. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper as well, UN urges independent probe into deadly Nigeria Chad airstrikes. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in politics, ADC now stable after Obi Kwankwaso exit, says Abdullahi. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Fayose rallies Ekiti APC supporters for Oyebanji's re-election. You get it on page 8 of the newspaper. APC battle screening role. The factions, violence fears over primaries. You get it on page 6 of the newspaper. Aviators protest assault. Demand sanction of Air Force personnel. You get it on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government fixes June for nationwide digital TV switch over. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Wike defense visit to APC chairman condemns politics of enmity. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to The Punch, boldly written, Dangote rejects NNPC offer to increase stake in refinery. Dangote rejects NNPC offer to increase stake in refinery. You get the full story on page 39 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 18, presidential fleet operations gob 4.24 billion naira in 6 months. Still in the same newspaper, UN demands probe into civilian deaths in Nigerian airstrike. Together on page 14 of the newspaper. Then on page 16 of the newspaper as well, 500 billion naira fraud probe. EFCC detains Energy Commission DG. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom, bank flag ex-AGF Malamis transactions weakness tells court. Together on page 16 of the newspaper. Customs, NDLEA intercept 16 billion naira cannabis shipment. Customs, NDLEA intercept 16 billion naira cannabis shipment. You get that on page 40 of the newspaper. US lawmaker bill seeks mandatory Sharia rejection by immigrants. US lawmaker bill seeks mandatory Sharia rejection by immigrants. Together on page 14 of the newspaper. Still in the foreign scene, US-based Nigerian doctor escaped death in Oyo mob attack. US-based Nigerian doctor escaped death in Oyo mob attack. You get that on page 15 of the newspaper. 2027, NDC reps caucus holds talks with Obi Kwankwaso. NDC reps caucus holds talks with Obi Kwankwaso. You get that on page 16 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph, boldly written on page 3 and page 29, UN calls for independence probe into Nigeria-Chad airstrikes. At the top of the newspaper, OPEC, Nigeria's oil production fails to meet quota despite 606,000 barrel increase. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Then on page 8 of the newspaper, Tinubu, Nigeria will spend about $11.6 billion servicing debt in 2026. Still on Tinubu, Tinubu arrived in Kigali to reaffirm Nigeria's commitment to advancing African unity and others. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, Ojikalu received Timeline NG Award for contribution to national development. Then on page 4 of the newspaper as well, have not gone anywhere. I'm APC member, says Fubara. Still in the newspaper on the foreign scene, Saudi Arabia, UAE launch covert attacks on Iran as regional war widen. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, zoning constitutionally, morally acceptable, opposing it an anomaly, coming from General Ibuwe, retired. You get that on page 2 and page 6 of the newspaper. NUC World Bank signed $65 million performance contract with 6 universities. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 6 of the newspaper, Wike speaks on visit to Hiowada. I'm not obliged to disclose my private life. Then on page 4, 5 and 27 of the newspaper, court jails ex-power minister Maman 75 years for 33.8 billion naira fraud. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. I am Kasitoni, and many thanks for watching.